Hey guys. All content discussed is due diligence gathered with aim at better understanding the nature of the current market in anticipation of the greatest squeeze in financial history. Let's dive in. This week ahead, we have some important events taking place. On Tuesday, the survey readings from the S&P Global and the ISM will be released for the month of August. The S&P Global Composite PMI is expected to have fallen further to 45, which would be down from the 47.7 in July. On Wednesday, we have GameStop's earning report, while also getting the U.S. trade balance report for July. On Thursday we have the Chinese inflation rate, and on Friday we have wholesale inventories report for July. Though American markets were closed today because of the Labor Day holiday, European stocks slumped, with the euro falling as the region's energy crisis continues to worsen. Wall Street equities did jump higher, however. The euro retreated to a two-decade low. I made a very thorough video this past Friday talking about all areas of the economy that are suffering, so if you need a recap on that, I highly suggest you watch it. Obviously not a lot happened today, and based on reading the comments from viewers, it appears that there is a high level of interest into the SEC and why they aren't providing the oversight or carrying their diligent duties to protect investors in the market. Long ago, I made a 3-episodic series that I released as morning videos, fully devoted to explaining why this phenomenon takes place. I think that a lot of my morning content that I used to produce went mostly unheard of, and that now more than ever, that information is needed to be heard. So, I compiled the 3 episodic videos into one and I'm going to release it now again. Let me know in the end what you think. So, every time we see blatant crime happening in Wall Street, we ask ourselves, why don't they ever go to jail? The answer to this is as paradoxical as it could come, and the answer is very complex. You could say politics, or blame a secret order that rules the world, and to a certain degree, your answer would not be far off. In the world, an act is only a crime if the government deems it so, and they continuously enact legislation to punish petty crime and let the big criminals scot-free. Federal regulators and prosecutors let banks and financial companies sign agreements where they pretty much wash away culpability and infringements without even having to admit guilt. As we clarified on the last video, criminals in financial institutions do not even pay their own fines. Due to some well-placed blind spot in the law, federal regulators and prosecutors make agreements with criminal institutions and members where when they sign the wrongdoings, due to them negotiating in the disclosure that they aren't guilty of anything, they can simply write off these fines as business expenses. This allows them, under the rotten eye of the law, to pass off their debt to consumers, and even get tax write-offs because it's a business expense. They defraud their own customers and then make them pay for being caught. It's so ridiculous that it's funny if you are cynical like me. Many say the law would not be able to stop this from happening, and that legislation against it would not yield good results. I disagree 100%. We take away personal liability from this, and it would cease to exist by the next day immediately. We start putting minimum sentences of 10 years for fraudulent acts, and JP Morgan's CEO will become the most law-abiding citizen by the next day. He would probably write a book about good behavior and how this changed him for the better, being a repeated criminal whose actions clearly show serious signs of psychopathic and narcissistic behavior. Everything to them is a tale of how the world wanted to burn them, but that's beside the point. We have gone far too ahead of ourselves. I promised you guys clear explanations and answers, and I intend on delivering. So, to begin with, let's undress the financial world. In the world of Wall Street, there is the public sector, and then there are agencies, some regulated and others who self-regulate. You have the banks, mutual funds and hedge funds, which you probably know very well by now. You have insurance companies, which I plan on doing deep dives in future videos. Then you have securities and commodity regulators like the Federal Reserve, the Office of Comptroller of the Currency, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. You also have the self-regulated organizations we talked about like the New York Stock Exchange. All the regulators that we just described have individual and unique duties and goals when it comes to protecting the markets. Then there are the big boys in town. You have the ever more vigilant Securities and Exchange Commission, whose restless endeavors have secured the bright future of us all. That was sarcasm, by the way. Then we have the Justice Department. The SEC is a watchdog, as they do not have prosecutorial power. They simply investigate and watch for violations like insider trading, making sure all financial information is produced and published in accordance to what is really happening. If the SEC finds evidence and build a case to prosecute someone, they tap the Justice Department, whose job, as you might imagine, is to take the bad guys to court. None of the agencies or organizations we talked about, except for the Justice Department, have prosecutorial power. The SEC is typically the one the other organizations and agencies tap when they notice something suspicious, and the SEC builds a case of evidence which they then submit to the Justice Department. As you might have conjectured, the SEC and the Department of Justice work hand in hand. They are two sides of the same coin, as one could not work without the other. In theory, the output of all these watchful eyes should be putting filth after filth out of Wall Street and into jail. But something interesting happens in all of this. When it comes to Wall Street, the justice system does an abysmal job at punishing financial crimes, and there is a large growing body of evidence that suggests that not only are they not doing their jobs, but that they have actually evolved the whole process to be an effective mechanism for protecting financial criminals. Unraveling this stuff will take us back a little over a year, when the cases of the biggest corruption in American history were thrown aside, being pursued too slowly due to the fumbling of governmental bureaucracy that we have sadly come to expect as a consistent state of reality. Let me speak to you at an individual level, almost like we are face to face. The problem with our current economic system lies in the fact that we have created a class for people whose aggressions and misbehavior are no longer seen as crimes under the eyes of the law. We have made a class for criminals that make them exempt from prosecution, regardless of what they do against the middle or lower class. Based on my research, the only time someone committed a notable crime and went to jail was when Bernie Madoff defrauded his clients, which all happened to be elite high-class celebrities and top Wall Street members. The only crime ever punished, according to data, is the ones performed against the high class, but we will get to that at a later time. Going back to the SEC and the Justice Department, if it should even be called that, they have transformed themselves, shifting to be keen on servicing to be agreement writers that remove liability and responsibility from criminals, and never exercising punitive measures that bring about any justice. In fact, if you are laughing at any of this, let me tell you that you are not the one laughing the hardest. Former chief accountant for the SEC Lynn Turner laughs the hardest in the room when it comes to the expectation that we have in thinking that the criminal justice system is broken when it comes to Wall Street. She said, and I quote, "I think you've got the wrong assumption, that we even have a law enforcement agency when it comes to Wall Street." To clarify, a chief accountant plays an important role as pursuing criminal financial disclosures. In the late 1990s, the SEC was zeroing in on Rite Aid drugstore chain, who were using a ton of accounting tricks to cook their books. But upon the moment the agency had collected enough evidence for prosecution and cracking down on them, the SEC decided to immediately delay the case, prioritizing it with other less important stuff, and relegating into the deal with it later file cabinet. Lynn Turner clarified, and I quote, "The Philadelphia office literally did nothing with the case for a year. Very much like the New York office with Madoff." For those that have not watched my previous morning videos, I discussed in detail how the Bernie Madoff event was actually known by governing and regulatory agencies for years before it all blew up. They simply let it slide by until the scheme came to an abrupt ending, and then upon congressional pressure, they were forced to act tough for the cameras and make strong speeches against corruption. So back to the Rite Aid case in which Lynn Turner was involved, what happened was that it dragged on for years, which by the time it finished, there were similar accounting crimes happening at Enron, WorldCom and Sunbeam. In fact, when the SEC punished Sunbeam's CEO Al Dunlap, he was given a mere fine of $500,000 million. By the way, Dunlap's net worth at the time was estimated to be $100 million. He was also prohibited by the SEC from ever running a public company again, being forced to retire with a mean $99.5 million after the penalty. Can someone please go check up on him? For the love of sweet baby Jesus, my boy has been tested in life. You know what's even funnier in all of this? My previous joke. You know how I made a joke about psychopaths and narcissists living in a bubble where everything needs to be about their own grandiosity and that they always end up needed to write up a book about how their world was unfair to them but they ultimate won, like a weird old Western movie? Later in life, Dunlap published his memoir titled, Mean Business. I kid you not, this dude spent the next couple of years collecting royalties from his egotistical last effort. I wanted to check on the sales of the book, but upon realizing that America and many other nations are obsessed with this type of behavior and reward them, I decided not to look at sales figures for the betterment of my health. But if you think these stories end up with just dismissals of cases to be relegated to the never-to-be-investigated file cabinet, you would be wrong. We had briefly mentioned the story of Aguirre, another SEC investigator who was fired after he questioned his supervisors and the agency's continuous efforts to barring him from pursuing an investigation into an insider trading case against John Mack, who would later on become chairman for Morgan Stanley. The story goes that Gary Aguirre was investigating a hedge fund owner and CEO named Art Samberg. Samberg got caught buying a large number of shares for a company called Heller Financial. Weeks later, the company was bought by General Electric. Clearly, someone had tipped Samberg about it, and closer investigation brought eyes to John Mack. To brief through the boring stuff, John Mack was also caught doing weird trips to Switzerland, interviewing for top jobs at Credit Suisse, which funny enough we covered them a ton on this channel when their business started getting busted after shorting meme stocks earlier this year. Our champion of the light Gary Aguirre was looking into the man for quite a while and collecting a ton of evidence. He eventually told his boss that he planned to interview John Mack, and that is when this tale turns tragic. His boss told him the case was not going anywhere, as John Mack had powerful political connections. As Rolling Stone sourced, the investment banker fundraised Ranger for George Bush in 2004 and backed Hillary Clinton in 2008. I mentioned this because it goes to show politics in this nation are done to divide and conquer, and that the real villains in the story play both sides because they own both sides. Things then started getting even weirder. Morgan Stanley's regulatory liaison contacted Aguirre about his investigation. Morgan Stanley then worked its way up the SEC chain of command. Another one of the firm's lawyers, Mary Jo White, was having direct conversations on the phone with the SEC Director of Enforcement. Funny enough, Mary Jo White was a former attorney for the Southern District of New York, which is one of the biggest cops on Wall Street. I'm telling you, the whole revolving door phenomenon is one of the biggest issues in the country. For those that don't know, revolving door is the phenomenon that happens when members of regulatory public agencies switch jobs to the private sector. They bring with them connections and top expertise that are crucial for Wall Street private companies to put to work in order to commit crimes and avoid prosecution. Morgan Stanley and their firms managed to talk to people at the SEC 4 levels above his head in order to see that no investigation was made. John Mack himself was represented by a man named Gary Lunch, who also happened to be a former SEC Director of Enforcement. Absolutely abysmal set of events for Gary Aguirre, who never even came remotely close to standing a chance against this army of ex-SEC professionals now working on behalf for one of the biggest financial institutions in the world. About a month after he complained that he was being blocked from furthering his investigations against John Mack, Gary Aguirre was fired without notice by the SEC. Disgust and despair in the system is a criminal understatement to be made. The SEC would actually go on to agree on a $755,000 settlement with Aguirre sometime later after he sued them. That was a bit of a happy ending for him personally, but it speaks volumes about a system that would rather pay for wrongful terminations of their employees rather than prosecute real criminals. It was precisely these types of actions that actually emboldened a wave of Wall Street institutions and executives to start committing a series of crimes ranging from insider trading all the way to fraud. The mountains of evidence were piling up the desks of workers at the SEC from unprecedented crimes, only for the cases to be pushed aside and not followed up. Executives getting caught changing their books to pay themselves higher bonuses to overseeing accounting techniques. At best, the institutions would pay very small fines after collecting huge amounts of profit, with none of the executives being prosecuted. At the very worst, the cases were pushed aside to cabinets where they probably still remain, covered under deep layers of dust. What this created was a clear incentive that was driven all the way up until the financial crisis of 2008. Even the worst criminals that literally were the ones at fault for causing the Great Recession to implode never saw any prosecution. Top players like the Lehman Brothers and AIG, 2 companies that caused the implosion, were willing and cooperating with governing agencies to supply them all the evidence they had against their very own executives, and nothing ever really came of it. Let me quickly tell you why this is. For the Lehman case, the SEC had a window of about 6 months before the economic crash happened to make a move against their CEO. There was a ton of evidence submitted stating that the bank was using an effective loophole involving restricted stock units in order to hide tens of millions of dollars for the compensation of their CEO Dick Fuld. A Lehman lawyer himself, upon discovering the criminal act that was taking place and notifying his own supervisors about it, was brushed off. He was told that the bank did not care and that the benefits of doing so outweighed the risks. A short time later, the SEC would enact new rules that forced companies to disclose all the compensations that restricted stock units executives had coming from them. This is where the story of Lehman gets interesting. Instead of coming outright and simply presenting the information, their lawyers and accountants filed a statement that covered the real figures. On one page, a chart would describe that Lehman CEO Dick Fuld had gained $146 million, and then on another page, the statement would state that their numbers previously stated were not the real numbers, failing to mention the real figure, which was around $263 million more than they previously stated. The lawyer that noticed all of this had quit his job because of the unethical nature of the business model of Lehman Brothers. He would then go on to contact the SEC many times and even Congress representatives about it, and he would be ignored in all of his attempts. Lehman, along with AIG, would crash the economy not too long after this lawyer quit his job. Imagine his face when Dick Fuld, testifying before the House Government Oversight Committee, would talk about how poor he had become. He would express, and I quote, "I got no severance, no golden parachute." Just so you guys know, Fuld was collected around $529 million from his tenure at Lehman's. Nothing ever came of this. For AIG, the case was even easier. The SEC even had plenty of evidence against them, including eyewitnesses willing to give testimony against the executives at the firm. To make it simple for you guys, AIG was caught overstating their earnings by $3.6 billion, a huge no-no. They were caught making bets on the market, playing with derivatives, which funny enough is exactly the same function championed by the current shorters delaying the meme stock squeeze. After AIG helped lead the economic crash, investigators were building a pretty hefty criminal case against one of their top executives, but as common sense should tell you, the case never went to court. Executives were even told they were not the targets of the investigation, and cleared of wrongdoings. They of course made public appearances before Washington, crying crocodile tears and pulling an Oscar-worthy performance out there, being given a platform to redeem themselves in the eye of the public. Keep in mind guys, though Lehman Brothers and AIG were the big dogs whose misbehavior just happened to become the snowflake to cause the economic avalanche, they weren't the only ones. Goldman Sachs were caught defrauding investors with really bad mortgages. Their executives would never see jail either. Citigroup Bank was caught hiding $40 billion in liabilities from investors. I said billion, not millions. $40 billion hidden away in liabilities from investors. Bank of America was caught hiding $5.8 billion in bonuses from shareholders, with the money going straight into the pockets of executives. Guess how many of these executives were prosecuted? Nobody was prosecuted, nobody went to jail, and these same things have continued to happen, though now the criminals have become more complex as to how they hide their nefarious acts. And the question then becomes, why does this happen? How do things get to this point? I know you guys are frustrated listening to this video, but it's important that you stay with me. I am done with the stories. I am now going to talk to you straight. We need to bring Gary Aguirre one more time, because he is actually the one who found the answer as to why there is no justice in the system. A couple of years ago, Gary Aguirre noticed an announcement post for a huge conference on financial law enforcement. Attendees included around 1,500 of the country's leading lawyers who represented Wall Street, as well as the top members working for the government at the Justice Department and the SEC. The truth is, ladies and gentlemen, that you have been led to believe that criminal justice, that prosecution, is a trial by combat in which the law and the private sector fight it out. This is entirely wrong, and you need to erase this from your mind. Criminal justice is a nice cocktail party between friends and colleagues, who every couple of months or years, tend to switch over from one side to the other. They are all good pals, good friends who even get to meet at an expensive private party at the Hilton Hotel and get to make connections between each other. Aguirre saw familiar faces in that party. The SEC regulators he worked with, the ones barring him from prosecuting John Mack, were now working for firms that represented John Mack himself. He saw his co-workers now working lucrative jobs at prestigious firms. You think it ends here? Aguirre would go on to tell how he saw the government's top cops, Preet Bharara, who was an attorney for the Southern District of New York. He was placed in this position due to recommendations by Chuck Schumer, who is one of Wall Street's favorite senators. Gary also saw Robert Khuzami, the SEC's director of enforcement at the time, and who had also served as general counsel for none other than the Deutsche Bank, another notorious institution involved in nefarious acts. Guys, let's take a moment to smooth things out. The revolving door concept that I have been trying to ingrain in a wrinkle into your brains for weeks is not an afterthought. It's not some edgy little concept that gives some answers as to why Wall Street doesn't get punished. It is among the biggest reasons for it. Criminals are allowed to network with government officials, who they then entice into joining the private sector and give them huge salaries where they are set for life. As such, there is a huge conflict of interest that occurs from this. We have evidence that everyone in Wall Street, from the private sector to the public sector, get together, mingle and network. The people trying to bring up cases of evidence against the biggest players are at a no-winning scenario. This is because once they start making noise, the person being investigated just has to call his friend at the SEC and make a case about how this is going to make him look bad, and then he won't be able to hire him or her at a later date. This then causes the SEC employee to shut down the case and put it aside. Furthermore, we have been led to think that even when cases do proceed, there is a huge battle between both sides. This is not the case. As I have disclosed, these huge battles are nothing more than a fine dancing interval between both parties where the SEC proposes them with an agreement that does not require the criminal to admit guilt, nor any executive to be named and prosecuted. They simply agree to pay a small fine for being caught and everything is back in order. There is no prosecution at all, it's just literally an agreement to not proceed with an ugly case. The fines are so small sometimes that some of you could even pay it with a year's worth of your salary. So there is an attempt to not prosecute anyone, and when the Justice Department along with the SEC can't brush it off, they simply agree on a paper to pay pennies on the dollar, something that the company can then use on their accounting to pay even less taxes since they can write these agreements as business expenses. This is why there is no justice for investors, so, we left off at the part where the system is set up so that, through the concept of revolving doors, the rich and powerful are able to network their way into the best talent at the SEC and Justice Department and hire them with huge pay raises and bonus incentives. Also, we see people at the private sector who are willing to take a couple years' worth of worst pay in order to get some experience at the government before returning to the private sector. Through revolving doors, private companies are able to retain the much-needed experience and knowledge to effectively employ schemes and get away with them. The problem is so bad that senators like Chuck Schumer have received tens of millions of dollars in so-called campaign contributions, a term that used to be called bribery back in the day, to select and handpick stooges for different positions at the government when candidates at private firms need to move back to work at the private office. Since we have mentioned an important politician, let's dive in a little more. Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, JP Morgan are all known to spend millions of dollars in campaign contributions. It is important to know that they invested a lot of money into the presidential campaign race of Obama back in 2008. Why did they invest so much in his race, you might ask? Because they wanted to ensure that he would pick candidates with connections to Wall Street so that during the fallout that took place after the economic collapse would not affect the deep pockets of Wall Street, and so that no one would go to jail. Let's talk about the facts for a second. Obama put a Citigroup executive in his economic transition team while also naming another executive from JP Morgan Chase his new chief of staff. He built a team made up of Wall Street executives. His administration would make a lot of strong speeches and give the impression that they were going to be tough on crime. They gave huge amounts to the federal government to catch wrongdoers. And what was the result of all of this? Well, the money did get tons of people arrested, but it just wasn't in the sectors that were important. Instead, the government would put the money to use in cases for prosecuting petty crimes. They would boast about deportations, or catching mothers who were defrauding welfare programs by maybe a couple $100 a year. They would put tons of money in small-time crimes and then boast about the numbers of criminals they prosecuted. But the big criminals, the ones that caused millions of jobs, millions of bankruptcies and home foreclosures, those never even saw the courtroom. They were let go, with all the tons of evidence against them being brushed aside. Obama made good on his backers' contributions, and fulfilled his promise to not let any of them face justice. Before we continue, let me address the couple of people who will be mad I called out on the Obama administration. You guys know I am not a political person, and that I do not claim one party to be better than the other. I abide by the fact that both are cut from the same piece of cloth, and that their effectiveness lies in dividing the American public by identity politics. That way, attention is taken away from the real issues and placed on trivial small issues. I used the Obama administration because he was the sitting president who literally ensured nobody would get prosecuted after the 2008 elections, and I hold him responsible for that. And this brings us to the most important point of this series, which lies in the events that took place after all of this. Thousands of Americans would go protest on the streets of Wall Street. But something interesting happened. The American media did not cover this as much as they cover other events. There was almost no spotlight on the protests taking place, which is really funny considering the media loves to cover everything that has to do with civil unrest. Thousands of Americans would be seen only on social media, talking about how they lost their entire lives' worth of work. They would talk about being unable to feed their families, or being kicked out of their homes, living in cars and behind dumpsters. There was no overly sensationalist coverage on this. All of these clips can only be found on social media by doing a ton of searching. During this protest, something occurred that has long been ingrained into a whole wrinkle. I clearly and vividly remember seeing the pictures of Wall Street executives going out to balconies, taking selfies of themselves having drinks and a good time while mocking all of the people protesting on the streets. Even today, you see these corporate media goons get on TV and belittle retail investors all the time. The concentration of power in Wall Street has outgrown itself from New York and stretched itself into every nook and cranny of the judicial department, and I find it now more important than ever to be hyper-aware of this phenomenon because of the threat it poses on everyone. Just last week, it is believed that institutions were allowed to leverage pension funds as a way to pay for a squeeze if the institution runs out of money. The level of criminality has reached levels never seen before. Many ask me all the time what can we do about it, and I will always say the best thing to do is keep each other informed. Knowing about these things is the most vital part in bringing change. This 3 episodic segments were some of my very first video I produced in the channel, so I apologize for some of the cringe in the format I made it. However, I do think the content and message itself is more relevant now than ever, so let me know in the comments what you think. I got some new due diligence to share with you guys this week, so I hope to see you guys tomorrow on the next one. Until then, hope you guys have an amazing rest of your day and to the moon.